You know, I've noticed something. People really seem to love making fairy tales just super dark. Not that fairy tales aren't pretty dark already, but that's a topic for another video. Yes, we have plenty of tamer versions, the classic Disney adaptations, countless children's books, an ocean of bizarre content-farmed videos with zero quality control slathered across YouTube. The lighter half of fairy tales has been well established for generations, but what's with this? And this? What is the obsession with taking fairy tales and turning them grim? This is a little awkward. Normally we would do a sponsor spot here to pay our bills and make sure all the artists who work on this show can, eat. But, as sometimes happen, our sponsor this time just sort of vanished on us. So, that's kind of scary. But I suppose also one of the risks inherent to running a show like this. So, if you really love the videos we make and you want to help our humans eat, even through weird situations like this, it would mean so much to all of us if you would consider supporting the show on Patreon or here on YouTube with memberships. Once per month, for less than the price of a cup of coffee, together you can make sure Tale Foundry is safe and our humans are fed. I've always thought artists deserve a better shot than they tend to get, and this is a very meaningful way for you to support 7 of them. And hey, when you support the show that way, it's not just charity. It's a way to turn some of your working hours into art that you may not have been able to make otherwise. That money represents the time you've spent to earn it. When you pledge it to us on Patreon or YouTube memberships, we see that as the equivalent of time spent working to make this thing, Tale Foundry, with us. Every patron is a little part of the team, and we love them all so much for it. A huge thanks to everyone who decides to help. Now, back to the show. Okay, it's not actually that strange of an impulse to want to make fairy tales dark, or at least darker. I can see the appeal. There's depth to find here. Stories like Pan's Labyrinth and Coraline are able to elevate the form of fairy tales by embracing the darkness inherent within it, which feels really powerful in the face of the sterility we so often see in popular entries and adaptations of the genre. I actually think there's a surprising amount of room for horror, drama, and melancholia in fairy tales, but what feels really strange to me is when it crosses over into the territory of Grimdark. Not bad per se, just strange. If you're not familiar, Grimdark is sort of the outer edge of darkness in science fiction and fantasy, and I use the term edge here with a lot of intentionality. These are stories built with such a strong aversion to light and joy that they often border on what I am going to call misery burlesque edginess. Think Warhammer 40k, A Song of Ice and Fire, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight movies, at times even the manga Berserk by Kentaro Miura. If you want to see it at full force, watch Repo the Genetic Opera. That one does not pull a single punch. These are all worlds and stories where blood, guts, oppression, reckless hedonism, and general misery are used to unapologetic excess. Rough places for rough people. Grimdark heroes rarely get to be heroes at all, usually swapped for morally indistinct anti-heroes who, in a saner reality, would be pretty hard to distinguish from villains. Characters who are innocent and pure are likely to be corrupted or killed, if only to put a finer point on just how bad things really are. Evil can certainly just be evil, but it's often so well-reasoned that it almost seems necessary. In the few places where light does manage to filter through, it's so addled by the suffocating darkness that it only shines a dim gray. In the land of Grimdark, there is not much room to balance both light and shadow. That's not actually a critique of the genre, by the way. Sometimes you just want to plunge into this murky, grayed-out territory. Sometimes a little misery is a welcome change. Sometimes you just need to see people battling it outright. But when you consider all of that, the trend of combining this genre with fairy tales does seem a bit bizarre, doesn't it? Trying to apply these murky gray dynamics to one of the story forms with the clearest distinction between light and shadow, it can have some really odd results. You get these stories like the 2013 movie Hansel and Gretel, Witch Hunters, where the kids from the story have grown up and, rather than moving on after their experience with the witch, they've become entirely defined by their trauma, spending their lives hunting down and killing all the witches that they can with an over-the-top arsenal of pseudo-medieval weapons. Or the 2012 movie Snow White and the Huntsman, where the evil queen isn't just evil, she is very literally a victim of the patriarchy and perpetrates much of her evil as a form of revenge. We even had one way back in 2005 called The Brothers Grimm, which, phew, that was a weird movie. Suffice it to say that it took the idea of fairy tale darkness to quite an extreme. Like, look at this. Some of this I could sort of see happening in a fairy tale, but probably not with that level of detail. Even outside of film, a surprising number of adaptations across media get this treatment. The old stories change, acquire a grit and darkness that carries them away from the simplicity of the original story. Adaptations of Alice in Wonderland often develop into tales of trauma and mental illness. Snow White is surprisingly prone to becoming a vampire who needs to be, put to rest. Even now, we're waiting on a game that presents as a combination of Pinocchio and Dark Souls? What? Again, I need to stress, these ideas are not bad. They can be really interesting. They can add a surprising amount of depth to a very simple and well-known tale. But it's hard not to feel as though there's a sacrifice being made here. As authors and artists push these stories out of the light and deeper into the shadow, they stop feeling like fairy tales. A process which tvtropes.org fittingly refers to as Grimmification. There are a lot of reasons to do this. I think the most obvious of them is that so many of these fairy tales have actually been taken in the opposite direction. Chances are the first time you heard them, you were hearing the sterilized versions, cleaned up for your tender little child's brain, the Bowdlerized version, the Disneyfied version. And as they say, opposites do attract. It's not hard to see the novelty in taking something so saccharine, so bright, and steeping it in gloom. Not a very deep reason to take it in this direction, but not all stories need to be deep. I'm sure they had better reasons for the aesthetic decisions they made, but this is always where my mind goes when I think of Tim Burton's 2010 adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. When you read the Lewis Carroll original, you get a sense that the characters live in a world full of magic and life, overflowing with shimmering ball gowns and precious metals and gems and treats. Despite the patches of darkness, the sun is always shining somewhere. Burton's vision of Wonderland is not quite that way. The world he's created is so muted and empty of light, it almost looks like a sepia photograph of Wonderland. Save for a few brightly colored characters and iconic touchstones, it's sort of hard to know that you're in Wonderland at all. It's certainly a novel take on the story, but is this really the fantasy we were hoping for? I also think this can be a much less seemingly shallow decision as well. Part of the grayness of Grimdark is also the presence of complexity. You have to ask hard questions about characters and their motivations because the ethicality of what they're doing just isn't always clear. Sometimes it really throws you into internal conflict. Although I'm not really sure I'd call it grimdark in the same way that something like Repo is, the 2014 movie Maleficent is a pretty great example of this. In the original Disney adaptation, the regions of light and shadow are extremely clear. The dark sorceress shows up for the flimsiest reason imaginable and decides not only to put a curse of sleep on Aurora, the king's daughter, but a curse of death. It's only through some magical intervention that she ends up a sleeping beauty and not an unalived beauty. The evil is pretty unmistakable here, but in their reconceptualization of the story with Maleficent, in order to introduce that complexity, roles needed to be adjusted. Darkness needed to crowd out some of the light needed to shine in through the shadows. In this version, the sorceress is simply getting revenge after a gruesome betrayal at the hands of the king many years back. What's more, she actually ends up taking on a sort of parental role for Aurora, so as the girl gets older, the sorceress starts to feel pretty bad about sacrificing her for the sake of a feud. Undoubtedly a more interesting villain, a more interesting story, but so far removed from the simplicity of the fairy tale form, I wonder, does it really count? But a lot of the time, I think there's a motive stronger than novelty, stronger than complexity behind these decisions. One you may not really be expecting. A desire for justice. I mentioned how often the first version of these stories people hear is also the cleanest version. I'll bet anything that, after hearing the decidedly lighter tellings, when you finally heard the older, darker versions, your brain stopped in its tracks. Wait a minute, you may have said to yourself. The hunter didn't really cut open the big bad wolf's belly, did he? Hang on. What happened to Cinderella's wicked stepsisters at the end of the story? Oh God, tell me the prince only kissed the Sleeping Beauty and didn't do any other weird stuff while she was unconscious. Shocking stuff after all the whimsy of the versions you've been told. Very easy to feel lied to, as if most of the story was kept from you and you're only now hearing the reality of things. Easy to want to correct that injustice, represent fairy tales in all of their true darkness, and despite their genre weirdness, I think that's part of why these Grimdark retellings seem like such an oddly natural progression. Why they're so resonant, why so many people make or have made them. I mean, how many videos are there on YouTube promising the original version of a well-known fairy tale? The dark truth behind the story. It's a common feeling, a common thought, a common desire, but I think it's also more than a little misplaced. One of the hallmarks of fairy tales is that, much like mythology, they're more like story forms than very specific tales. Remember, most of these were collected from oral traditions and transcribed. There's no telling what the actual original version of the story is really like, just the oldest known or first recorded versions, and sometimes we don't even have that. Behind most fairy tales, there's a diverse body of tellings and retellings which create more of an impression than anything resembling a canon. The Arne Thompson Index does a pretty good job of demonstrating how this works. For instance, it designates the story Rapunzel as tale type 310, which falls under the categories Tales of Magic, Supernatural Adversaries, and, most obviously, Maiden in the Tower. The story may change, it may be called Rapunzel here, Petronella there, Prunella elsewhere, Juan and Clotilde, the Canary Prince, but the contents are all there. This story has a form which we recognize regardless of the differentiating details. Who are we to say any of them is the true story? The truth is that there's a maiden in a tower. The rest changes with the telling. Even in the case of stories with distinct authors and known original versions, like Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll and The Shadow by Hans Christian Andersen, the symbolism and meaning of the stories have come to so far outweigh the adherence to canon that through tellings and retellings over and over, they now resemble less stories and more story forms. They become fairy tales, which is why I think this justice-seeking is sort of misplaced. Honestly, the bowdlerized, sterilized, Disneyfied version of any given fairy tale is usually just as valid as your gritty, overcorrected misery burlesque. Both versions still use the story form, they just tell it differently, like fairy tales have pretty much always done. So now that we've done away with the notion that grimmifying a fairy tale is just doing right by it, I have to wonder, how is steeping it in shadow any better than bathing it in light? Well, I mentioned the urge to do this for the sake of complexity earlier, and like we saw in the case of Maleficent, it can sort of elevate the story experience. But this is where I think the sacrifice happens. Another hallmark of the fairy tale form is that, by virtue of being built from archetypes rather than very specific tellings, these stories are just simpler. The symbols are very clearly symbols, and the ethics are pretty well defined. You almost always know evil when you see it in a fairy tale. Instead of complex philosophical lessons, fairy tales often provide metaphors simple enough that we can take them apart and examine them, symbol by symbol, quite easily. The separation of light and shadow, the simplicity of the symbology, is one of the reasons I think fairy tales are one of the most persistent story forms and why everyone loves to play with them so very much. They are stories, but also toolboxes. And in creating so much complexity, in obscuring the clear boundaries between light and shadow, the Grimdark retellings remove that quality almost entirely. But then, that is a form of play. After a fashion, this is still people using the toolbox of fairy tales to create their own stories, which I do respect. I don't think the goal should be to preserve the virgin story form of the fairy tale or anything like that, but I do think some things end up lost in translation. I do think, shorn of their distinctive complexity, the symbols writers call on to create these gray retellings end up sort of powerless and awkward. Not wrong, not bad, but I mean, look, it's hard for me to feel the same way about Hansel's confrontation with the witch when the movie also gives him magic-induced diabetes, which he has to take a shot of insulin for every few hours or he'll die. Something just feels lost in that. These stories feel confused to me because they simultaneously want to be fairy tales, but they also try so hard not to be. They want to be complex or serious or adult, and unfortunately, very much of the time, it kills the power of the fairy tale, reducing it to a mere aesthetic decision painted over an otherwise entirely different kind of experience. And I find that unfortunate, because I really do think there are ways to find this complexity, this meaning, this form of rescue for a form of story, as Tolkien put it, that's been relegated to the nursery. We could, and probably will at some point, do a whole video on Stephen Sondheim's incredible musical Into the Woods, but for now I just want to pull one idea from it. There's a song somewhere near the end where the witch says to a cast of characters from across various fairy tales, "You're so nice, you're not good, you're not bad, you're just nice." And I think that introduces an interesting third axis to the fairy tale dynamic. The darkness doesn't have to blot out the light need not cut through the shadows. There can exist a world that still feels like the stuff of fairy tale, and it can have depth and complexity and nuance without turning into a murky gray haze. Most people aren't good or bad, they're just human. They may fail, they may decide poorly, but they need not curse an innocent child for the sake of their feud with someone else, or be the stunning and gallant prince come to save the damsel. Sometimes you're just a person lost in the woods. It can be scary, but it will never fail to be beautiful. And I think part of what makes a fairy tale is that those things are allowed to coexist. If you really mean to speak in their language and use their symbols, let the light and the darkness be. No need to correct for either of them. I think you'll find that there's more than enough room for both, and plenty in between. Before we end, I just want to remind you that this show is in part possible thanks to all our lovely supporters over on Patreon and our members here on YouTube. If you can, a small pledge goes a long way to providing our artists with a level of stability and security that ad revenue and sponsors just really never will. As we've seen with the sponsorship that fell through for this video. A huge thanks to everyone who decides to help. As you navigate the dark wood, take a moment to appreciate its beauty too. Stay brave, stay curious, and as always, keep making stuff up. Bye!